Hello, everyone. This is the Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism podcast. I am honored to have my guest today, Professor Samer Aziz. I am Inji Higazi, the research manager at Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism, and I also teach at the Middle East Center here at the American University in Cairo. My guest is Professor Samer Aziz, who's an associate professor of politics at SOAS, the University of London, and author of the amazing book, Politics in the Crevices, Urban Design and the Making of Property Markets in Cairo and Istanbul, published by Duke University Press in 2023. And also the winner of our inaugural annual award, the Samer Soliman Book Award, which the Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism project awards to the best book in the field of critical neoliberalism studies and critical political economy in the Middle East and North Africa region, widely understood. Professor Aziz is also a Lever-Hume Research Fellow, researching the project Clouded Politics, the Political Economy of Digital Infrastructures in the Global South. Again, I'm very excited to be in conversation with Professor Aziz today on her book, reflecting on her research process, her very rich theoretical interventions, the case studies in two of the Middle East's oldest cities, as well as her future research projects. Thank you, Professor Sara, for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Inji. What a wonderful invitation to be speaking to you and to the Pathways Project. I have to say, it was just such an honor to be recognized by the project and to receive the inaugural Samer Soliman Award. So I just want to say thank you all for that honor, and I'm really excited to be talking today.
Great. Okay, so I think we can start by going back to the origins of Politics in the Crevices. Very wonderful title, by the way, but also says a lot about the what you were looking for. So I'm interested in hearing more about how the idea for the book came to be, how you brought together these two large cities that are overwhelming to understand on their own, but also 6 neighborhoods, a multi-sited ethnography in 6 neighborhoods. How did the idea come to be? What motivated you to bring these sites in conversation with one another? And yeah.
Amazing. I mean, I think there are a couple of questions in there. I'll start with the kind of origin story to, why I was looking at these cities or the city and how I got to Crevices. So I had the incredible fortune as a graduate student very early on to take a class with Timothy Mitchell, who just kind of twisted how I saw the world, right? So, we were seeing politics in geology, in the design of buildings, the infrastructure, I mean, all over the place. And, the life cycle of a mosquito. And it just kind of blew my mind. And I decided, well, I think what I really want to do is just see the political where you least expect it. And then I got really excited about this idea of infrastructure, design, buildings, all of that early on. Took a few classes early on the city, just got, enamored by it. It was just, loved just thinking about politics through windows and balconies, and there were incredible people to learn from. Farha Ghannam's work, Gyan Prakash, Asif Bayat. I mean, just so many people who saw such huge political processes in these details. And I was like, well, that's where I want to be. Let's go and see, what can we learn about the world from what I, later came to call the crevices of the city. But I was also a political economist and really care about inequality. Actually, my time at AUC was, I did my undergrad there, and it was a time that made me keenly aware of questions around redistribution, around inequality, and I just couldn't shake it. Class politics, and it was a really powerful kind of, let's say, kind of coming of age, like experiencing that and really thinking through inequality and redistribution. And so I also knew all throughout that I was really interested in those questions. And from that, reading a lot about neoliberalism, about markets and so on. So that was kind of the two strands that slowly but surely came together in the book. And at some point, I decided there is so much writing about the informal city in the Middle East, but actually not enough about kind of the formal city, not so formal, I guess the gray areas in the formal city, right? And so I wanted to think about these questions with all of the incredible writing that had already been done around different areas of the city. And so and I started to think about historical neighborhoods also because heritage and memory are really interesting and they allow us to kind of think about what's at stake in terms of meaning making. But yeah, it was mostly this idea of how do you see the political where you least expect it, and how would we see political economy, especially differently from the city. So that was kind of the origin story. The second question about the cities, right? Cairo and Istanbul. So Cairo, I mean, so I knew that I was very interested in big cities, living in Cairo, growing up in Cairo. That scale mesmerized me. I was very interested in what can learn about it from it. But I also was really intrigued by this idea of seeing it through kind of almost a lens of a different city. What would we see differently about Cairo? But also, what would we learn about different places from Cairo? And I serendipitously kind of found myself learning Turkish very early on and falling in love with Istanbul. And over time was like, wow, these would be amazing to work together, right? And to learn about them together. And being two of the three largest metropolitan cities in the Middle East, I saw myself as a scholar of the Middle East. It all made sense. And so the design then became, how because I'm interested in different scales, which I think we'll probably talk about at some point. I wanted to have the leverage of talking both about macro processes operating at the scale of the city, but also at the scale of neighborhoods, at the scale of communities. And so I decided I was going to try to see if I could study three different neighborhoods in each of the cities, neighborhoods that were undergoing urban transformation projects that were really, the point was let's see what happens when there's so much at stake, right? There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of change in a particular neighborhood. What do we learn? But also beyond the spectacular, right? So much of what's written about in neoliberalism is written from the vantage point of spectacular violence and dispossession. And I really wanted to kind of, in that moment that we think is very dispossessive, what does looking at the quiet, the subtle actually tell us? And so I looked at three urban transformation projects, and my interest in choosing them was thinking of different actors in the city who are shaping the city. Because I'm a political economist, I was thinking of actors who had different relationships to the market. So the state and its agents, the international NGOs or IGOs, and also corporate actors. So I chose urban transformation projects depending on who was leading those projects. And that's how I ended up with 6 neighborhoods, which was, I have to say, in hindsight, a little too much for one book. But it was very fun field work. So, can't complain.
I mean, the fieldwork stories in the book were just very lovely to read and engaging, and adds, I mean, a lot of texture to these, as you said, like grand scale processes, the everyday, which is often not only overlooked, but like sometimes not known to exist, right? The crevices, this argument that you make. What I mean, particularly appreciated in putting these two cities in conversation was how at multiple points throughout the book you say that, well, this process was unfolding in Cairo, but it was also similarly unfolding in Istanbul, and there's nothing like exceptional about what's happening here or there. So it's really this question of an exceptional event or process, or how Cairo, for example, is undergoing an exceptional transformation, which can sometimes be a trap that both scholars and observers fall into. You make very strong statements and well evidence that actually it's not that exceptional. And I know that this is part of your broader intellectual project as well, de-exceptionalizing the Middle Eastern city. And I wanted to hear more from you about how you were actively thinking about this while writing the book, and especially that you were telling like the story of the neoliberalizing city, which in the literature tends to be the global north, Western European, US city, for example, and how you were telling the story of the neoliberalizing city from the Middle East as both an active, like theoretical and methodological and political move on your end.
Thank you. I mean, you've definitely picked up on one of the things that I'm really passionate about, this idea of de-exceptionalizing Middle Eastern city and the Middle East as a region. I have written about it elsewhere, as you're kind of alluding to. You know, it's one of my big pet peeves, honestly. This idea, what I saw really in my training in graduate school was just the way in which Middle Eastern cities got pigeonholed over and over again into very particular frames and modes of thinking about them through kind of lenses that set them aside as exceptional, and hence difficult to relate to their own specific politics, and that honestly made it such that it was almost kind of like you're in this little area and we can't really learn much from you, but it's good for you guys to know what you guys are doing, kind of, and that really annoyed me. So especially because it just like, I had never thought about Cairo that way. I had grown up both in Cairo and the States, and it was, it seemed to me like experiences that mirrored each other in particular ways, and that also sat against each other in particular ways. And it was interesting to kind of live with that tension rather than just think of it as exceptional. Yeah, and so I became really interested, and there was a group of scholars who were really interested in that direction too. So I wasn't, I didn't feel like I was alone in this, who really wanted to talk about the Middle East in terms of connection, in terms of learning, in terms of, how the Middle East, how these cities are connected to other nodes around, whether it's the global South or the global North, shaping those dynamics and being shaped by them, that these systemic forces are not just like coming from one node and just like escalating, and rippling out in some ways, but rather like being kind of formed and made in different places and coming together and against one another in those ways too. So thinking dynamically in that way, I think, is much more interesting about not just our cities, but about kind of these processes all over the globe. and the processes themselves. So the places and the processes become much more interesting when you don't pigeonhole them in that way. Especially problematic is the fact that when you talk about the Middle Eastern city, which I've written about, then you become, there's obsessions around the role of religion, the role of, or thinking about the lost cosmopolitan city and a very particular politics around that, and authoritarianism, right? In this way, as if like there's, all the authoritarianism in the world is happening in these, small area, and they just can't get over it. And, the democracy wave is always passing by the Middle East, and they're just exceptional in that way. And that's it, end of story. So the book was much more interested in, and saw like, I saw day to day, whether it was before or after I did my research, or during my research, that this was just disingenuous to the experience, right? What I'm seeing is actors who are, thinking of plans for Darb al-Ahmar from Geneva, or thinking about what happens, sending experts to Tunis to think about Cairo or Damascus. I mean, there was a lot of learning from India, a lot of learning. So it was really important to think about all of these networks together, and connection as kind of the new thing for me in terms of moving beyond exceptionalization.
Yeah, I mean, that pushback was, I mean, clear also in not only in the conversations that you were having around many of these development or urban renewal projects, but in specifically like the fieldwork story that you begin the book with, of imposing, if I may say, a certain ideal of community, of talking to each other, of neighborliness onto Cairenes who live in a specific part of Cairo, because there's this imaginary, right? So these tensions as well. And this pushback that you make, not only against that literature that tries to pigeonhole not only Cairo as a city, but like certain also parts of Cairo as stuck in time, or having to look a certain way, or exhibit a certain community life that matches up to certain imaginaries that are divorced from reality, right? But you are also, in doing so, we're trying to push back against this totalizing neoliberal ideal and imaginary as well, that looked at cities as, or private property for these communities and individuals as opportunities for profit. But you also make very clear and direct moves against certain approaches in the literature, even from within the critical literature. So for example, you argue against a simplistic reading of accumulation by dispossession as the only neoliberalizing process that defines the urban experience in either Cairo or Istanbul. And thinking about neoliberalism from these places, but also from the global South, is not only not to, I mean, insert pathways, but it is what we undertake. And trying to speak to the literature doesn't come without its challenges, right? So I was wondering about some of like the challenges, theoretical, scholarly, that you faced while engaging with this kind of dominant literature. If you think that there is a path now that has opened for more critical voices and understanding the neoliberalizing or neoliberal experience in the region, especially when it comes to the urban.
Oh, yeah, great question. I mean, so the project is definitely, or the intervention of the book is definitely to try to add complexity to how we talk about neoliberalism from a critical lens. So I wasn't going to, I decided early on that I wanted to speak to the people who had inspired me, rather than opening up a whole kind of worms about everything that's ever been said about neoliberalism, right? And so, and the book is very much engagement with literature that had thought very seriously about, concepts like accumulation by dispossession, and corporate capitalist power and wealth that has been transforming the cities pretty aggressively. So as I say in the book, I find that literature quite inspirational in a number of ways. One way is in tracing the origins of kind of a systemic embrace of neoliberalism to the kind of the power of this corporate capitalist class, but also its crisis, right? Its crisis as colonialism doesn't, starts to get dismantled, and their access to particular resources and the ways that accumulation used to work under colonialism starts itself to fall apart. And so I find that really, really interesting, and thinking about that class politics really interesting, and its relationship to empire and colonialism very interesting and very convincing. But I think the issue that I had was that it just didn't map on to what I was seeing in the cities, right? There wasn't that kind of omnipresence of one particular politics or one particular and wholly dispossessive project. So it wasn't all cranes and bulldozers. It wasn't all destruction. There was a lot of interesting moments of creation and malleability and navigation that I was very interested in. That, at first actually took me by surprise, but then, I got very excited about. And so the idea is to say, actually, what I'm seeing on the ground is that, yes, some of that kind of dynamic is there in the city, but there's so much more in terms of the room for political maneuvering, even within what we think of as market or marketized politics. And that's how I like to think of neoliberalism, as kind of the overall cumulative kind of dominance of the market in how we think about the political. And so the argument then is to say that the modality of the market is actually not completely driven, or doesn't actually allow for just one class project. And so that class project that we think of as like the origin story of a neoliberal system doesn't actually succeed in fully permeating the modality of the market. And what you see instead is that other political projects try to kind of wield their way in through that same modality. And in that kind of, I argue that is the malleability of the market. Now, what's interesting is to see a world of politics that, or of marketized politics that does have that diversity of political projects, and how that actually then transforms the polity. And it's there where I argue that, these politics, right? So you're actually seeing people kind of what I call a battle for housing, if you're thinking specifically about property, where there are projects for social justice agendas, for affordable housing, alongside projects to kind of exclusively siphon off parts of the city for like a luxury clientele, that are all sitting in the same kind of space and using the market logic, all of them together, and to see them kind of vie against one another is where the tension is where the politics is. And I argue that then you see that actually what that does is it displaces so much of what we think of as politics into debates and contestations and struggles around the design of the city, the crevices of the city, rather than large kind of town hall conversations around rent or around corruption around land, or some of these things where we usually go to find a political. And that from there, I kind of build the argument around seeing politics in the crevices as actually kind of a systemic displacement of the political onto the city's crevices. In terms of a challenge in the scholarship, I mean, I haven't, it was a challenge building the argument because, so much thinking about class and neoliberalism and its weddedness to a particular class project is a quite dominant way of thinking about it. Even for me, right, it took a while for me to break free from it. It actually took my students to help me see it. In other words, teaching classes at Oberlin College on the political economy of the Middle East is what helped me kind of make a lot of the connections that I then came to do in the book. And it took that kind of freeing from like my persona as a PhD student, my worries about literature and scholarship, and more about like thinking with my students a bit freely, to see that there were ways in which this was really helpful, but other ways in which it wasn't, and to kind of build that argument. And so far, I think what I have to say is it's a wonderful scholarship to interact with, because it's a wonderful group of generous people who really want to see kind of people building upon one another in terms of theory. So I found reception to be quite generous in that sense, especially in relationship to conversations about the market and so on. So yeah, it's been interesting.
Well, that's amazing. And like, just as a point on your students having you break free from this, when I taught a Middle East urbanism course last spring semester, and the majority of the feedback, like I had my students write like one thing you learned or one thing you want to learn more about. And like majority of them said that the one thing they learned the most, or that they started thinking about infrastructure as a non-neutral actor. And that really alerted me to, not only the salience, but also timeliness of your argument. I mean, we see all these, especially here in Cairo, massive infrastructures taking over the city, but then how to think of them as political, from like the material that they're built from all the way to how they designate space and beyond. And really, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from your book is, and here I'll read it out early on in the introduction, when you say, quote, "Some of the city's most pressing class politics are materializing as battles over the design of clotheslines, water pumps, and balconies, rather than being fought through political party campaigns or contentious town halls." And I think, I mean, this is great, because if we do look for the political, like official political party forum or programs, especially in Cairo today, we can go away and think, well, there is no urban politics, right? But then if we look at all of these, as you name them, crevices of the city, it's everywhere. And the tension and the contention specifically is there. So I was really interested in this scale. And as you mentioned, like it's a multi-scalar ethnography of these two cities, of the six neighborhoods in both cities, and thinking about this performance of politicization and depoliticization. And you do argue against this like blanket depoliticization project, or neoliberalism as only depoliticizing, but that it actually replaces or displaces the politics, and thinking about that in relation to these the balconies, the clotheslines, the water pumps, but also community, right, as another scale, I know, and a bit more presented as large scale, but you look at it bottom up, if I may use that term. So I wanted to hear more from you about how it was thinking about these scales, how they fed into the argument, and more about that research process.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing is to play with scale, right? It's really what I wanted to do in this book. It's why I started with the clotheslines, or actually, I'm most comfortable with the clotheslines, right? The clotheslines, the balconies, and I felt like if I were to leave myself, just kind of sit with them and sit with what my interlocutors saw in them or saw in their design, or the battles over their design, something interesting was going to happen. I'm glad I did that. It took a while for me to trust that, I have to say. It's hard to do. But it was really rewarding, because from the book, right, there are moments when I find out about hidden murals, and other times when like an entire organization like the Aga Khan Foundation gets politicized through how young men see it stealing treasures from tunnels, right? Like it's just if you really kind of slow down as a method and sit with kind of what you're hearing about that, about the crevices, about that scale, it ultimately will lead you to really interesting questions across multiple scales. And that's what I kind of was really hoping for. So what happens when I read the archives of these organizations, think about their finances, think about who's doing what, as I'm letting kind of these stories that I heard on, in the homes mostly of that were renovated, or in the workshops where people were kind of experiencing that urban transformation, or what does sitting with these things together, how does it click? What does it tell us, right? So I think of it as like a mode of inquiry, right? But it necessitates a certain level of trust in that you'll get there. But also kind of a curiosity, right? Like, if I follow this thread, where is it going to take me? And a real kind of comfort with it doesn't actually, right? That the more it sounds hierarchical, there's something wrong, right? Like something, let it play around, let it be flexible, what happened? And so that was my approach. I don't want to make it sound easy, because it was not. It was actually very difficult to put these things together. It took me many, many years, as you know, to write this book. And it's because of these anxieties of like, how do I make these scales actually sit with one another? Where am I going with some of, like, am I sitting at the clotheslines for too long? Like, what am I actually seeing, right? Like, is what I'm seeing actually truthful to these connections and to these linkages? So to sit and kind of develop these things, it really does take time. But I found it worth it. I think, of course, I've been asked to what extent I think these linkages can be, like in a political science speak, validated across, or have like that external validity to other cases, or to like more generalizations about theories and so on. It's a great question. I think my kind of thinking and my method is to like stay as close to the actors and the spaces and the sites as possible, and let them kind of get me to these places. And I feel pretty confident once they do that kind of work, and I can really see the practices coming through what I thought, and that they are saying something, right? And so it's just a question of like taking that time, seeing those patterns, sitting with their accumulation, and allowing things like rumors about treasures to become the spaces where you find the political, where you really, ask the big questions. Don't know if that helps.
No, definitely. And I really like this sensitivity to this particular scale, right? Like, and also I know it comes with a lot of justifying why it matters to these broader like disciplinary conversations, especially in political science. But exactly, this is where the politics unfolds, not only the interesting day-to-day lives, but events and activities with larger ramifications, as you do point out. And I mean, I really want to relate this to the reflection on community, right? And taking it back, or linking it to neoliberalism and its totalizing both logics, but also sometimes how we tend to read it as totalizing, like perhaps against our own interests. But there's also this project of, or mobilization of, certain community ideas or ideals that you do trace in the book, either as a class project or redistributive practice, but also reflecting on neoliberalism and rootlessness, right? That it comes with this sense that everything is always moving, that it's fleeting, you can, be anything and everything. But yeah, I mean, some of the tensions around thinking about community, especially in post-independence era, so neoliberalizing Cairo and Istanbul, these grand nationalist projects that were slowly dwindling by the time that you begin this research. So Yeah, I was interested to hear more from you about especially community.
Yeah, I mean, community is it's really interesting. We've written a lot about it, especially for people who write about Cairo. I was actually a little nervous about writing about community again because I thought we've spilled so much ink on this. But then I couldn't help it, right? Like when I asked about the water pipes and the water pumps, and I started getting these answers, I just there's no way around it. You have to really interrogate what's happening here. Um, and so, but one of the things there are a few things I found pretty interesting about community. The first one was um, it's actually so in some ways imposed and in some ways not. In some ways, it's very, very messy, even for the people who claim to be building communities. So there's a part in chapter 4, I believe, where I talk about how team within the Al Khan Foundation themselves think of community very differently from one another. um, and how the team has people who had, for example, grown up in Darb al-Ahmar and have a very particular reading of who they're living with, and are very anxious about calling any of this community. They see it as a very kind of mistrusting group of people living together, and others who see them as just like an insanely strong fabric, right? And that you're just here to kind of steer it in the right direction. And I found that fascinating, given that they were all implementing this project together, mobilizing community in very kind of stark and like, I don't even see it as subtle ways, right? And community really comes up a lot when we talk to this project. So that kind of the many layers were really interesting to dig into, but also what I realized is that we don't talk about the spatial dynamic that is at work when we say community, right? We talk a lot about these social networks, but there is a really interesting way in which space is used to demarcate insiders, outsiders, what like and space not always like in a bordering sense, but also in one's relationship to a particular understanding of the space, as we see, for example, with downtown Cairo, and how the Ismailia Consortium wanted to kind of really work on making the point that community for downtown is not necessarily just the people living there, right? And so there's also a lot of contestation around that. And it was about people's relationship to the space in particular ways that would create these linkages for these projects and for their protagonists. So I got really interested in for us to kind of think about that and to kind of dismantle a little bit the what I would call almost a romanticization of community. I think for a while, a lot of things were very difficult to grasp onto, right? And at some point, people were like, "Listen, um, Cairo is going to be okay, or the urban dweller, wherever they are in the global south, is going to be okay because they have these communal networks. They'll figure it out, right?" And there's almost like a safety net thing. And of course, we've learned and we've read about how the safety net then becomes itself politicized by neoliberalism, which is a really kind of inspiring argument. But I think there's a way that all of these arguments romanticize community, right? They miss the hierarchies, they miss the competition, they miss the dynamics within those communities that many are trying to escape. Actually, I met a lot of people who didn't want their neighborhood to be constructed around that community that we have in our heads. And so there was this angle as well, the romanticization, that I wanted to kind of right there are definitely things about that are very very much that I saw in the city and around the community that we've talked about for a long time, but also other things that I felt like had been brushed aside to allow for this romantic image of the community that was going to kind of overcome the evils of neoliberalism, and not seeing how much it was already kind of entrenched and wedded within. And perhaps sometimes it was that politics that enables particular versions of neoliberalism to take root. And I think that we don't really talk about the latching of neoliberalism on other politics. We talk about it as if it's this thing that comes and just like pulverizes whatever was before it. But actually, it's the logic of the market is so insidious because of how well it latches onto existent politics and existent struggles. And that's actually the scariest thing for me, is how much it does that so subtly, in ways that then are actually very hard to disentangle. And community is one of those for sure.
No, absolutely. And I think it's a very salient point, right? It's like what community, or treating community as a monolith, but then the community that the private developers have in mind versus the community of the people actually living there versus, I mean, the state. I mean, you think about this in a multi-scalar way, which really brings this tension to the forefront. And also, I mean, I think you were trying to root this in the spatial, like, transformations of these neighborhoods. And I was pleasantly surprised to see how you were tracing like rootedness and exodus or rootlessness through the dismantlement of cornerstones of the nation state, like the industrial or industrialization projects, and especially in the chapter on Cairo, you talk about how this rootedness then enabled a dismantled industrial project to be channeled into the urban core. And that was a very important and original move, I must say, that industrialization was not just dismantled, right? It was rerouted and treated as an outsider to these spaces, or just the workshops should be dismantled and brushed aside. And we see this continuing today. So I have two kind of questions on this front. I mean, in tracing the role of industry, excuse me, in industrialization slash deindustrialization, I mean, it is very central to how you trace property regimes. Was it something that you set out to think about? Was it something that you encountered along your fieldwork? Because it's also in the discussion on Istanbul and who came to own the seafront housing, also very central in the movement of labor, of course, the formation of these new communities. So yeah, I'd love to know more from you about this, and especially as you related to the crisis of the neoliberal project as it continues to, yes, latch onto these existing spaces and ideals, but also experiences intense crises, and by virtue of that, also these spaces and communities experience these crises.
No, great question. I mean, you're hitting on sort of one of those moments when I was writing the book that was so exhilarating because of how surprising it was, right? Like it came to me when I kind of I just didn't see it coming, and it was great, and I really kind of enjoyed doing that tracing. But you're right, actually. Istanbul is where I kind of saw this first. In a sense, it's just thinking about the working class in Istanbul, their relationship to the Golden Horn, especially to industrialization, deindustrialization, what that meant for their property, how they related to industry, how they related to work over time, was fascinating. And, you know, I have a whole argument about thinking about value, and how they saw value in their property, but also in kind of their daily existence, who they thought of themselves vis-a-vis Istanbul, right? The huge class politics around who is not Istanbul, or from Istanbul, and how, you know, these populations that had come in and kind of basically carried the city in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, with its industrialization, gets sidelined as the migrants, right, as the outsiders forever. Interestingly, are not, you know, even more embedded in the city than the Caireans I'm talking about. because they're mostly property owners, right? They have titles to most of this core urban fabric that is now seen as this like part of this kind of image of Istanbul as a global city, is mostly owned by the working classes who carried the day with the industrialization project or the ISI kind of moment. And so I find them fascinating. I find their their rootedness, their ideas of value, also the way they mobilized their networks. So village networks, kinship networks, all of that, and how it kind of became embedded in how property was understood, was lived around the work in the factories that then become dismantled. So yeah, I mean, Istanbul just made me fascinated by this whole kind of movement of what we think of as migrant, what we think of as rural urban migration, what it's doing in the city, and how it relates to this industry. And then kind of serendipitously, actually, as I was wrapping up the book, saw all of this in Cairo, right? I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, okay, that's interesting. I don't know. I think I went in writing about pollution, came out writing about industry. It was just, right. I started to think about the workshops, and then I started to look into these surveys that I had had for a long time, just hadn't read them in this particular way. And it kind of blew my mind, the numbers, I mean, it just, wow, like, so if you haven't read the book, right, we have this uh, phenomenon where I'm seeing, a lot of people who had been living in historic Cairo and Gamaliya and Dar al Ahmar move out of the city, perhaps live there, but work in, the industrial, cities that Nasser is building, and possibly before that as well. You see them getting degrees in the new public universities, so on and so forth. So in that immediate post-colonial moment. Um, and then we kind of think macro scale, right? With the infitah, with the open door policy as well. That's, there's a dismantlement of of that industrial and kind of factory setting. And it's read as kind of a deindustrialization end of story. But actually, sitting in those workshops, sitting in these neighborhoods long enough, I realized that so many of the same people who are working in those factories are back in Gamaliya, are opening up storehouses and workshops that used to do artisanal work and so on, and transforming it and bringing in such huge heavy machinery, right? And there's really interesting survey work to kind of document this over the 70s, the 80s. And you're seeing them bring the skills and sometimes the actual machine parts, I believe. I can't fully prove this, but definitely the skills to use kind of huge metalworks, and also establish this kind of modern furniture industry in Darb al Ahmar, that is very loud, very industrial, very active, and we do not talk about it, right? And in fact, dub as this informal something, right? Rather than thinking of it as a circuit, right? As a circuit from those factories that were celebrated and seen as the like part of a post-colonial heyday. Instead, we don't think of it as a continuation of that, which actually so much of the work is actually that same circuit. And instead we talk about it as this like marginal, informal, people just making their way and surviving, also destroying heritage. And we just, and then it becomes kind of looked at in kind of the aid sector and all of that is that almost kind of vilified way, right? And problematized, right? As you said, crisis around informality. And it's really fascinating to think about the politics of how something like this industrial circuits transforming into this vilified informal sector. And about whose voices are being heard in the city and about how we really, really think about what is not industry, depending on who's doing it and where, or how, grandly as well. So yeah, I had a lot of fun tracing this part.
No, it was really fun to read. And again, like, yeah, surprising in the best way possible, right? Like, this is okay. Like, I haven't thought about it this way before. And you're right. I mean, and this also has to do with, like, I mean, the historiography of the neoliberal period or neoliberalizing period in Egypt, specifically more broadly, which I'm more familiar with, is that there was this sharp break between what came before and then what came after. But then really the traces that were left, not only the spaces, but the people who manned these factories, who had this knowledge, this expertise, and how they were, as you said, rerouted through the circuit on an urban scale. And yeah, it's just how and where we should pay attention to them. So no, thank you for including this in the book. And again, I mean,
Thanks for
this
picking up on it.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. And it definitely relates to, I mean, back to the main methodological move of the book, right? The crevices, thinking about these spaces that I mean, yes, now people are thinking more and scholars are thinking more about neoliberalism in less formal spaces, but especially in urban studies on Middle Eastern cities, as you absolutely noted at the beginning of our conversation, it's these dominant analytical categories like the state, the market to an extent, but you do give this process, this market making and meaning making, the texture, and highlight all its contradictions as well. So I wanted I mean, think with you about where you see the life or many lives of this work and this book, especially as it speaks to current transformations in Cairo and Istanbul. I mean, can we speak of what is happening right now as also a continuation of the same neoliberalizing process? Again, as like a label that we try to make sense of all of these rapid and violent transformations which you trace in the book. But yeah, their intensification today. Relate this back, as you said, this question of crisis. You went in looking for pollution, but there's also ecological crisis that is very much embedded in space and in these transformations that just, I mean, moving trees, pouring in insane amounts of concrete, but also how this relates to just the flow of global capital more broadly, to de-exceptionalize what is happening as well. This is not exclusive to either Cairo or Istanbul or to Cairo today, but we see it unfolding across the global south and the global north. So yeah, I mean, how do you see this work speaking to what is happening now?
Um, so I think so in the afterword to the book, I gesture to kind of a reflection on thinking about neoliberalism and kind of a strongly populist turn that became very othering and then very violent, autocratic in Turkey and in Egypt. But I think took people by surprise even more in Turkey. And honestly, I get asked, right? Like, why are we still talking about neoliberalism, right? Like, where's neoliberalism? Like, any rule of law, any of that. I mean, people kind of think neoliberalism, think markets, think there's some kind of frameworks that are essential that now we don't really see at work anymore. My answer is to think less about these kind of procedural ways in which we are thinking about neoliberalism and more about like technique, right? And so for me, I'm really interested in market as technique. And that's for sure still really, really important and transforming and dominating politics in really important ways. But also, a major part of the argument um, is that the ways in which the marketization of politics has displaced the political onto the crevices of the city has produced a polity where so many of those struggles, so many of these contestations are not in kind of a clear commons, let's say, right? Which again is idealized, but still are becoming more and more and more difficult to recuperate, difficult to navigate, difficult to communicate, and creating, right, the kind of conspiracy theory culture that we see, the suspicion, the festering kind of these contradictions. I mean, we see throughout the book all of these contradictions that come from channeling all of these politics subtly and quietly and without really being transparent about them, right? So the more you do that, the more you produce a reaction to that contradiction, to that and suspicion. Festering politics is kind of is one of the messages of this book. And suspicion and othering are at the core of populism, right? How do you get societies to kind of polarize in this way? Well, breed suspicion, right? So, so for me, actually, neoliberalism and what we're thinking of as its aftermath are not its aftermath, right? They are actually kind of wedded to one another. They are two faces of the same coin, really. We could maybe think of it in a staged manner, but I do think that market as technique is definitely alive and well, and it continues to kind of breed that suspicion and that festering politics that makes it very hard to come back from actually this kind of polarizing politics that you see even, I mean, quite aggressively in Egypt, but also in Turkey. I mean, actually the difficult thing about studying Istanbul was just how violent the urban transformation project was. So interestingly, I actually started from this like moment where I was asking myself, you know, I kind of came to this expecting to see a softer hand in Istanbul and a not tougher one in Cairo. And instead I saw a really violent urban transformation projects kind of going all out in the early 2010s. And in a way that actually I didn't see as much in Cairo, and I was really baffled by it. But it also made it then very difficult to move beyond that spectacular violence and really still be able to see the quiet and the subtle and how it was operating. And so doing kind of studying Cairo and Istanbul together allowed me to both see kind of more of the violence of some of the projects that seemed very quiet in Cairo, but also more of the subtleties in projects and spaces that seemed to be undergoing a lot of violence in Turkey. And then to kind of see the relationship between this initial very violent project on the city in Istanbul as it took new guises later after I had done some of this field work, right? And then saw the state quite transform quite, you know, actively and like much more transparently into this kind of autocratic, what people want to call autocratic backsliding or whatever. But also urban activists in Istanbul had seen it way earlier. And this is actually one of the reasons why I felt like I was onto something, because when Gezi happened over trees, right? It was about the crevices of the city. And I was like, I think we are all seeing something really interesting about where this politics is actually materializing. I feel like I've missed other layers to this question. So follow up.
But it's actually given me a lot to even like think about and follow up on. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know, was Gezi like right in the middle of your field work or after you concluded field work?
No, it was right after I completed. In fact, I was,
Amazing.
you know, in New York physically, and it was very heart-wrenching not to be there.
Yeah.
But it was remarkable to see that many of the urban activists who had really welcomed me to their circles. I mean, in Istanbul, it was a very vibrant space. Were all there, and I like saw them everywhere, whether, you know, all like on video and writing and in the protest marches they were organizing. And it was really quite phenomenal. So felt very connected to it, even if I wasn't there physically. But yeah.
But yeah, and it buttressed the argument for sure.
No, I mean, it's helpful, very helpful to think through some of these questions that were at the time like really muddled in my head. But Gezi was definitely a moment to help me really think through what that meant. Yeah,
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, one final question and reflection. I'm interested to know if you're taking some of these questions onto the next project. I mean, the title is also fascinating, Clouded Politics. So can you tell us a bit more about where it is, where it's going, where it's taking you? Are you also thinking about the urban in any way? Yeah, what are your future goals with that project?
Um, Thank you. I'm excited about the project. It's a new kind of research phase. So the project is looking at digital infrastructures um, from the global south, specifically following cloud technologies and cloud infrastructures across Africa and Middle East, and thinking from those spaces about global kind of digital infrastructures. Um, so so very quickly, you'll see I'm again interested in materiality. So, we talk digital, we talk platforms, we talk apps, we talk, financial tech, so on and so forth. And I found that most of, especially in political economy, most of what we've been thinking with has been that um, non-material kind of products, right? That are coming out of this digital revolution, and now AI. So a lot about platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, even kind of, yeah, I mean, the whole kind of world of fintech and what it's doing to payments, or how we think about money, or how we think about debt. But I think we have not given enough attention to the ways in which that non-material is related to and shaped by and shaping the material, right? And infrastructures, right? The crevices again of the digital, basically. So what happens when we're looking at networks and small routers and and big cables and power and electricity and but also concrete, and what it looks, what's the relationship between the digital world and concrete, and the kind of inner workings of data centers and the tunnels that you have to navigate as someone working in a data center, for example, on a daily basis, or what that looks like. Or so yeah, I mean, the project wants to kind of connect that materiality to think about and immaterial, to think about a number of things. But at the heart of it, I'm really interested in how we think about corporate power in this moment. So there's a lot has been said about big tech, but a lot of it is very, again, like this omnipresent, really big, really scary kind of actors that are in a way kind of just have taken over our lives with this tech that is everywhere. And I want to sit with what happens when we look at them from their infrastructures, from the vulnerabilities in their infrastructures, right? And so the first piece of writing from this is all about vulnerability. I'm trying to think about, if we look at the nodes, at the moments when things falter, things fail, they're challenged. How is it that corporate power regroups in those moments, and as it builds its infrastructure, and what does it do with it? So yeah, I mean, this is I'm still kind of interested in politics where you least expect it, and the crevice. This time a lot more on infrastructure, but cities will always be interesting to me. And so, I find myself thinking about the relationship between data centers and the cities that they're sitting in or on the peripheries of, the ecosystems. I mean, part of what I'm really excited about is thinking about how we reimagine the economy on top of something like the cloud. And necessarily, I found that there's a really interesting ways in which cities are vying to reimagine themselves as digital cities, not just the smart cities. I'm thinking of ecosystems as places where the economy is remade through the digital, and cities are vying for particular labels, and there are entire kind of world of rankings of cities in that way, and that affects their their access to resources, how money's flowing in, how water is leaving or coming, how electricity is bundled and grids are constructed and renewable energy is constructed. And so thinking about these things together is at the heart of the project, which currently is a little kind of going in different directions. I do know that initially I'm going to be writing about the corporation.
Oh, sounds fascinating. And I also see the same thread of like following the intimate spaces, but also how the digital world really shapes our like intimate day-to-day lives and just the details of everything, the way we shop, how we consume, how we present ourselves, identity. But also, you've been following, like this has become a very urgent conversation in Cairo because of the recent blackout, the internet blackout,
Yeah.
and just this realization, I mean, this vulnerability couldn't be more
Yes.
timely to think
Yes.
about.
Right.
Even if there is an imaginary of like omnipotence or that it won't fail, right? That we rely on the internet for everything. And increasingly, or I mean, certain groups of Egyptians are increasingly more cashless, like with instant, like just apps that you use to just transfer money, to pay even like, yeah, like fruit sellers or vendors or, yeah, people that you wouldn't pay with a credit card, and then suddenly having this realization that life stopped when yeah, and then thinking of course about this from the scale of how corporate power and the state converge to shape this day-to-day experience. So couldn't be more timely, fascinating as
No,
always.
absolutely. And the role of fire and disaster and thinking about that kind of dimension, not to mention, as you mentioned earlier, right, like ecological disasters and their relationship to the digital is going to be really, really interesting, and pressing for us to
Globally.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah, and globally with the whole
Um,
discussion on AI and water, and yeah, it's
yeah.
just very, very timely. So I
Yeah.
look forward to the piece and multiple pieces that will come out from this project. Congratulations again on the fellowship.
Thank you so much.
Um, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I had so much fun. I have a lot to think about already. And congratulations again on the Samer Soliman Book Award. It was very exciting to have you as our inaugural winner. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have a lot more activities about the book coming soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Angie. This was really, really enjoyable and really brought the book back to life for me. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, and again, just such an honor to have the award. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you doing the podcast about it. Thank you.
Of course.